Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room, where we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today, we're pleased to have Ambassador Max Baucus with us. He's the former U.S. ambassador to China from 2014 to 2017, and a former senior U.S. senator from Montana from 1978 to 2014. We're going to talk about the U.S.-China relations over the last 30 years, from engagement to competition. Ambassador Baucus, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Wenqi. It's a real honor to be talking to you. This is a subject that's dear to my heart. I really care about the U.S.-China relationship, so thank you for the interview.
You've been on various news programs saying Speaker Pelosi should not have visited Taiwan and that President Biden looked weak to China. What did you mean?
Well, first, it's the goal of U.S. policy toward China to reduce tension, not to increase tension. I think that Speaker Pelosi's visit unfortunately increased tension in the relationship between U.S. and China. The White House also did not want her to go. They felt that it was wrong. It would increase tension in the relationship U.S.-China. And add to that, there was no reason for her to go because I think Taiwanese citizens and Chinese know where the U.S. is with respect to Taiwan. I mean, the U.S. espouses the One-China policy, but in addition, the Taiwan Relations Act has been adhered to by the United States, where arms have been sold to Taiwan. Add to that, there have been lots of visits by American political figures to Taiwan. So it's clear with America that America has a strong relationship, very strong relationship with Taiwan. So there's no reason for her to go. So that's why I felt she should not go.
But she felt that her going actually shows stronger support for Taiwan, especially given how China has been increasing its aggression towards Taiwan. So by going there actually shows the U.S. commitment. And it was a pretty big boost for Taiwanese people. So how did you think about that?
Well, it's Taiwan is a very delicate matter in U.S.-China policy. It's very delicate. It's very problematic. It has to be handled from a U.S. perspective and from the Chinese perspective very carefully. Now, Taiwan is a democracy. That's clear. But as everyone knows, who's a student of the question, the more Taiwan either declares independence or moves very, very close to independence, the more mainland China is going to feel it has no alternative but to, by force, probably take over Taiwan. Now, Speaker Pelosi's visit did more than show strength, American strength in respect to Taiwan. It also tended to move the needle a little bit more toward independence. I think a lot of Americans really don't know very much about the Shanghai Communiques. They don't know about the consensus. They don't know about the Taiwan Relations Act. To be honest, a lot of Americans think that Taiwan's a separate country. And what right does China have to be involved in a separate country? And that's not what it is. But Speaker Pelosi's visit, it tends to encourage more independence in Taiwan. And the more independence is encouraged, the more we're getting close to a tipping point where there's going to be we're in a dangerous situation.
It's interesting that you think her visit encourages more independence when Newt Gingrich also visited Taiwan in 1996. And that wasn't framed as a pro-independence kind of trip. And also, currently in Washington, D.C., a lot of people would argue sort of the old framework of independence or unification with China doesn't really accurately explain people's thinking in Taiwan right now. It's really about, especially in Washington, D.C., strategic clarity, and the One China principle versus One China policy. I mean, it just seems that the framework of discussing Taiwan or U.S. Policy towards Taiwan has now changed. So how do you think about those changes? just especially given you've been involved in, all these conversations for the last few decades. Clearly, it is somewhat different right now.
Well, there are a lot of questions there. I'll do my best. Number one, the Speaker Newt Gingrich visit was a long time ago, and actually there was an arrangement, a compromise made between the United States and China that is on that with respect to that visit, which lowered the tension. And the compromise was that Speaker Gingrich not fly from Beijing to Taipei, but rather go to Tokyo first. He did that. He first went to Japan, and then later on to Taiwan. So number one, that was a long time ago, and there wasn't a compromise. There was an agreement at that time between the United States. If not agreement, there was a kind of a compromise that both countries adhered to. But right now, the situation is so different. We have the president, Tsai Ing-wen, is more independent than some of her predecessors, and she seems to be running on a kind of an independence, not quite independence, but close to an independence position. And I think, and add to that, it's my understanding, you tell me, you know much more about this than I do, that the Taiwanese people are drifting more and more away from wanting to unify with mainland China. There's still a good percentage that does, but a larger percentage, is my understanding, does not. Now, in the meantime, as the tension between the U.S. and China has increased, and the tension is much greater now than it was during Speaker Gingrich's visit, because the tension is so great. Everything that China or Xi Jinping does, or anything the U.S. or Joe Biden does, is magnified. It's than it otherwise would be, and a lot of Americans and a lot of American public figures are very concerned now about China's rise, about China's strength, about China's intention. Very concerned, and partly that's because China is opaque. It's not an open system, so it's very hard to know what's going on in Zhongnanhai. What's going on over there? What do they cook? What are they cooking up? So I'll just briefly, there are many who in the United States who are very hawkish toward China, and they're very concerned. I want to beef up U.S. military, worried about maybe China taking over Taiwan, or maybe China pushing out its PLA strength out more into the Pacific. So it's a different situation today, and that's why it's much more volatile, and that's why a visit by the speaker today, under these circumstances, is much different than it was back then.
I understand your view on this, and what do you think then, given how today's situation is so different than in the past? What is the current U.S. goal with China? I think in the past, it was pretty clear, right? The U.S. wanted China to be a part of the global economic and trade system, wanted to be a good player, a contributor. But some argue that, especially now, helping China enter into the WTO was perhaps a mistake, because we have not really changed China's behavior. Instead, China has become more assertive and is promoting its values and political system as more superior than democracy and free market economy. You also said that U.S. cannot stop China's rise. So how should the U.S. think about China right now? Do you think Washington, D.C. has a clear idea or strategy?
I think it's evolving. I don't think it's as clear as I think it should be. Really, a very seminal moment was in Anchorage between Yang Jiechi and Tony Blinken. That was not a good exchange. That was sort of the beginning of a downfall in the relationship. And I'm very sorry that exchange occurred the way it did.
Did you think that was intentionally put on as a show, or the dynamics was truly that intense?
I'm not sure. I'm told that, who knows? One version is that Secretary Blinken was earlier in Japan. He got all riled up, and so he had two speeches, and he gave this tougher one rather than the softer one. The Yang Jiechi had two speeches, and in response, he gave the tougher one rather than this softer one. I don't know. Add to that, though, I think the Secretary Blinken's speech reflects a lot of what many in the administration think, and also is somewhat a product of domestic politics in America. Both Republicans and Democrats and the administration and the Congress today are quite united in their deep concern about China. And no member of Congress, whether a senator or a House member, dare stand up on the floor of the Senate or the House and say something constructive about China for fear of having his head taken off. I mean, it's so criticized in America by many in the American press, and especially Republican members of the House and Senate. They're afraid if they say something constructive about China, they're going to be facing an opponent in their primary race. Some other Republican will challenge them in their primary who is more hawkish than that person is, and they don't want to be primary. They don't want that competition, so they're very careful. And the careful thing is to be quite critical of China. That's unfortunate development today, and that's partly, I think, Secretary Blinken somewhat reflected that view in America. President Biden does not want to be perceived as, quote, soft on China. And he just cannot be perceived as soft on China. And if he does anything or says anything that allows that perception, man, oh man, will he be criticized very, very strongly, and he doesn't want that. And, there's an election coming up November of this year, the presidential election coming up November in 2024. And a lot of this is politics. It's domestic politics. And that has a lot to do with the tension in the relationship.
You were a U.S. Senator before, and a very senior one, and you actually had to deal with a lot of domestic politics when it comes to China, especially with regards to trade. Is it getting worse when it comes to how U.S. domestic politics is actually affecting how we talk about China, and even potentially the executive branch policy towards China? I mean, in the past, you would say, okay, the executive branch and legislative branch can have very different views on China, or during the elections, you can be tough, but then once you get into the administration, you need to be more rational, reasonable, quote unquote. But it seems that, the difference is not that great right now. I mean, what is really going on?
Well, when I was in the Senate, frankly, I was a very strong proponent and advocate for China entering the WTO. I thought it was a good idea, because if China is a member of the club, it's more likely to perform according to the rules of the club. And if China is outside, not a member of the club, not a member of WTO, it's more likely that China will go its own direction. And it's rather to be all the countries be together rather than moving separately. I was very impressed. I came over to China. I've been to China many times before I was appointed ambassador. And I spent a good bit of time with Zhu Wengji. I was very, very impressed with Premier Zhu. I thought he's one of the smartest, brilliant persons I ever met. And he was talking about WTO, and he urged me to help. And I wanted to help, and I did help. His argument to me, it was in part, Senator, push me hard, because then I can push back upon the non-reformers in China. So help me. You can help me by being strong and reasons why China should be a member of the WTO. And I sponsored or co-sponsored, I can't remember which, legislation of PNTR for China. I just felt China should be part. Now, back then, that's almost 20 years ago. It was good policy. China was not a big issue. China was kind of the little brother of the United States. People looked at China; they weren't terribly concerned about China. So I, as a member of the United States Senate representing Montana, I got no criticism, none whatsoever, for doing something positive. And frankly, I think China's membership in the WTO has been very good. Now, some Americans say, well, gee, the trade deficit exploded after China entered the WTO. And it is true, it did. That is, China exported many more products to U.S. than vice versa. But after a while, China took cases of WTO, as has the United States. And my judgment is both countries have won a few cases, but WTO is a little weak right now. It can't really set the rules of the road as well as it should. But that was fine back then. But now, as we've been discussing, there's so much tension between the two countries. And it's wrong. I have a view about this. I think we're almost there, not quite. It may take maybe even a year. For Americans to finally realize, and for the Chinese to realize, that, hey, it makes no sense to criticize each other. Sure, we each care about our own national security. That's number one. But there's too much name calling and sanctions cause more problems than do they solve. So let's realize that, hey, from American perspective, China's not going anywhere. China's always going to be there. It's going to be a big country, a huge country. It's going to be very influential. The United States isn't going anywhere. It's going to be big. It's going to be influential. So let's try to figure out a way to respect each other. We'll have differences, major differences, but let's talk to each other respectfully, not critically. I know it's hard because one's authoritarian, one's a democracy. It's very different. It's also hard because Americans know very little about China. Never been to China, know anything about
Absolutely.
it. And vice versa.
Right. So I think that would be that would mean the media probably doesn't have more business, or think tanks or media pundits or politicians, have no more business not to criticize China. But I think when you were ambassador to China, that's when we really saw China becoming more confident and more resistant to U.S. demands. So it was not the tension didn't come out of nowhere, right? We did see a more confident and just, again, a much more resistant China to a lot of U.S. demands. Then during the Trump administration, we obviously saw a hardening U.S. position. So I'm curious your view, how much of those changes was because of Xi Jinping's leadership? As you said, Zhu Rongji, seemed like a very open-minded prime minister back then, but this is a different leadership. Or do you think a lot of the changes was due to Trump's policies? A lot of people may argue that. Or this was just inevitable given, it's the closing power disparity between the world's number one and number two?
I think a lot of factors. I think your last point is the major one. It is somewhat inevitable. It's the old thing, the so-called Thucydides trap, rising power, established power. I mean, it's true. I mean, the established power gets a little nervous when it sees a rising power. What's that rising power all about? They're going to threaten us. And the rising power is feeling confident. Hey, we're going to be, king of the hill here. We're going to do okay. So it's a lot of that is just natural. However, I also felt I saw some of these changes beginning to occur when I was serving the U.S. over in Beijing at 2014 to 17, when Xi Jinping as president was clearly gaining his confidence. That was a time when he was pursuing his anti-corruption campaign. And a lot of people, Chinese I talked to, kind of like that. They're cleaning up a lot of the corruption they saw. Well, obviously, on the other hand, he's using that to clean up some of his enemies too. He's able to consolidate power with the anti-corruption campaign. It's clear that that's what he was doing. It's also clear that he was really starting to consolidate power. Watching him and first talking to him at many meetings, but also watching him at the summits between Obama and himself, it was clear that he's the man. And add to that, there's a lot of internal squeezes within China. NGOs were stripped of some of their powers. Journalists were rounded up more. Social credit system, I think, was starting to go into effect. The Great Wall, Internet Wall, was tightening up a little bit. You could just feel, and also a big change occurred when Eric Snowden's revelation came upon the scene. I was over there, and boy, Chinese got really, really concerned about U.S. spying on China. And I had long conversations with them about all this, and we agreed. I mean, of course, both countries spy on each other. U.S. spies on China, China spies on the U.S. All countries spy, that's just the nature of the game. However, when it comes to commercial espionage, that's different system. We like to think we don't spy for commercial reasons. And the Chinese, I try to get the Chinese to differentiate. In fact, the head of cybersecurity, or forgotten that the leading was Liu Wei, and Liu Wei back then was trying to say to me, no, there's no difference between commercial espionage and national security espionage. And I said, no, there's a difference, and you guys you're spying for commercial purposes. Yeah. But what I'm really getting at is China then passed, in the wake of Eric Snowden, many national security statutes to bolster up their national security, but use those statutes also to help their companies. So it wasn't just Chinese national security; it was Chinese economic security. And China then talked a lot about indigenous innovation. Xi Jinping in 2025, made in China. Now all that is starting to happen when I was over there, and Americans see that in 2025. And the American companies kind of feel a little bit squeezed. It's hard to get, a little harder to get permits. Local companies tend to get favored a little more, and it just adds up a little bit. So a lot of this was occurring before Donald Trump. Now Donald Trump came along, and he felt that the key to his success was America first. Just pulled up the drawbridges. It's all American production. We don't engage with our allies. We've slapped tariffs on even not only China but our allies if they're sending products that compete with our products we make in our country, like steel, aluminum, for example. And so Donald Trump accelerated the tension with One China. It was already starting to happen, but he accelerated it, and he really took advantage of a very deep, fundamental sense of unrest in America. Americans at that point are starting to get a little nervous about their economic security. And they say, oh my gosh, there's a great big country, China, over there. And we don't know much about China, but boy, that's kind of scary. And Donald Trump tapped into that.
I mean, you're absolutely right. Just connecting the dots between the domestic politics and how China became almost like a scapegoat. Of course, there's a lot of what China did was also increasingly bothersome to from the U.S. and Washington, D.C. perspective as well. So what is next then? There's no regular dialogue between U.S. and China. It's not like when during Obama administration, there were, economic and strategic dialogues. And it's not just about bilateral issues, but also global issues. There are a lot of issues that depend on the two countries to talk to each other. So with the midterm elections in November coming, as you said, and stronger congressional support to deter China, we see just different legislations, military to deter China militarily, politically, and economically. It seems unlikely there's going to be any progress between this bilateral relationship, but more deterioration. How do you think about this? Is there any turning point?
Well, that's a fundamental question that many of us are asking. You implied, and I tend to agree, that the midterm elections will not change the relationship. It just won't. In part because once we have the November midterm elections in the United States, then we're immediately in the presidential contest for 2024, and that's going to get political. It's unfortunate, but and who knows whether President Biden will run again for president. He might not. He may be a lame duck if he decides not to run, and then that means he has less power with respect to China or any other country. It's going to be difficult. Now, Winston Churchill once said, and there's a lot of wisdom in it, the democracy is absolutely the world's worst form of government, except there's none better. What he's really saying is democracy is messy, it's crazy. People say a lot of crazy things. The press prints stuff, and it just nuts. But there's deep resilience, and in many democracies, we like to think there's deep resilience in American democracy, but we'll see. The jury's out. We'll see the degree to which we can get our act together. I don't see much. Well, let me back up. We first have to diffuse the Taiwan problem. We got to reduce tension over Taiwan. That's the biggest problem our two countries are facing right now, Taiwan. And my judgment is all three parties, U.S., China, and Taiwanese, have to say, well, wait a minute here. Let's kind of be careful with what we do or what we say, because we don't want war. We don't want to stumble into some kind of war. Many commentators say that's what happened in World War I. The country just went adrift, and that could have been prevented. And clearly, we want to prevent any major military operation that puts the lives of Taiwanese, Chinese, or Americans at risk. That's number one. That takes a lot of cool, calm thinking on the part of Xi Jinping, Tsai Ing-wen, as well as Joe Biden. They got. I know they care about that, but that really is in terms of timing, number one. Second, beyond timing, beyond Taiwan, it's I've often thought, these dialogues, I mean, they're kind of formalistic. S&EDs, they're fine. I've been to many. But my gosh, all the work that goes into them and what comes out of them, not a lot. But still, we're talking. It's good that we're talking. Because either we hear each other's point of view, even though it's all predictable, we still hear it and we have dinner together and so on and so forth. Now, there's one person I've noticed during all these, and I probably should not mention his name because I don't want to hurt his future in China, but that's Wang Yang. He is one person I've noticed in a lot of these S&EDs that is very even-headed, level-headed, and I just have the highest regard for him. And he's in the standing committee. I appreciate that. And I just hope that the makeup of the standing committee, when it's announced, the 20th Party Congress, is one that's where the Chinese feel and Americans feel, well, gee, maybe there's a little signal there. Somehow the composition, when the president, Xi gets reelected, the composition of the standing committee might indicate some of the signal that we really want to work together and be open and so forth. I sometimes thought it'd be great if Joe Biden and Xi Jinping would not just go for a walk and talk, and without their handlers, without their briefing materials, because president leaders are really pushed by their handlers. All these position papers. You got to do this. You got to do that. And it's so complicated. There's a temptation to kind of follow it. But really, you got to trust your common sense, trust your instinct. And this, I know this is crazy. I know it's crazy. But with President Biden, President Xi Jinping, kind of together alone, and go just start talking about this. And once they start talking about all this, I'm quite confident that it'll move more towards, say, how do we get better along here? What do we have to do so it'll get a little bit better? Because neither country wants war. Both countries want peace. We both do. And if we do, well, let's start doing a few things which show that we do. Now, it's the old thing in life. It's doing is much more important than talking. You got to actions speak louder than words. So each has to do something, not just say it, but do something that shows that it really wants to slightly begin to accommodate the other constructively.
I think you're absolutely right. Well, sounds like this fall, whether it's the U.S. domestic elections or China's 20th Party Congress, will change some of the dynamics. So hopefully not for worse.
Right.
And then secondly, I think, as you said, the two leaders need to just have an in-person meeting, basically. I think COVID obviously has not helped. There's some hope that I think during G20, there may be a chance that Xi Jinping and Biden may travel. And so there may be an occasion for the two to actually have an in-person meeting. We'll see. But today, I just want to thank you so much for your insights. It's decades of wisdom and observations. So it is an awakening moment for the world, though, that we urgently need to understand China and communicate with China better. So thank you so much, Ambassador. I wish you and your family the best, and take care.
Thank you. I'll pass on your best wishes to my wife, Bella. She'll deeply appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.